That was the trailer for the HBO documentary An American Bombing, The Road to April 19th. And this is Factual America. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood. Each week I watch a hit documentary and then talk with the filmmakers and their subjects. Why would a U.S. military veteran decide to blow up a federal building in Oklahoma City, taking the lives of 168 innocent people in the process? This is one of the questions that the Emmy-winning filmmakers Marc Levin and Daphne Pinkerson tried to answer in their film, An American Bombing. Some of the answers might surprise you, with roots in the economic upheaval of the last 50 years, heavy-handed policing by the federal government, and a string of forever wars, all on the watch of both Republican and Democrat administrations. Join us as we talk about the Oklahoma City bombing and its relevance 29 years later. Stay tuned. Marc Levin and Daphne Pinkerson, welcome to Factual America. How are things with you?
Very well, very well.
Getting great reaction to the film, I have to say.
Oh, that's great. Well, just to remind our viewers and listeners, we're talking about An American Bombing, The Road to April 19th. It today is April 17th, and it released yesterday on HBO, and you can stream it on Max certainly for those in North America. And we were talking beforehand, and we'll Google it to see where it might be showing in your own locale. I'm not sure. We're not quite sure about the whole Max streaming element to this, but it's great to have you on. Thanks again. And how we usually start is we ask our filmmakers to tell us what's their film all about. Maybe you can give us a synopsis. So, Marc, if you kick us off. What is American Bombing all about?
American Bombing is about the evolution of domestic political violence in the United States, using the Oklahoma City bombing as kind of a lens to look backwards and to look at what's happening now. So Daphne and I actually did a film back in 1995 after the Oklahoma City bombing. It was on NBC called Oklahoma City 1 year later. And we stayed in touch with some of those people we met back then. And when we started talking about this idea, they were the ones that said, now is the time for a film like this. It's important because, believe it or not, the Oklahoma City bombing is not in the curriculum of any high school, American history, except in the state of Oklahoma. And a lot of younger generation is really not aware of what really happened then and its significance.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And why is it? Why has this become a forgotten bit of U.S. history? Why do you think that's, and that's, same way, when I heard that they were going to have a doc on about the Oklahoma City bombing, I was like, well, sure, there's been one. And then you find out, no, there really, well, except for what, the immediate aftermath, no, there hasn't been one. We're nearly 30 years on. And I know it left an incredible scar in Oklahoma City, literally and figuratively. I mean, I know they've now built the monument and everything. I was last there in the late 90s, and it was still like almost it happened the day before. But I know that it takes a while for these things to heal. But so these people are still living this on a daily basis in their lives. But why is the rest of the country been so quick to forget about it?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. First, 9/11 obviously eclipsed a lot of things. And you can see ground zero from where we're sitting right now. So that's one reason. Second reason is I think it's very hard for us to accept that it was an American, not a Muslim fanatic, but it was one of our own, even a war hero. Mm-hmm. And I think in the popular imagination and a lot of popular culture, it was kind of digested as the act of a lone bomber who just kind of lost his way after the Gulf War. And it was never connected to a wider movement, which is what we tried to do in this film, is to contextualize it. That McVeigh was inspired by, nurtured by, encouraged by a movement of anti-government extremists who declared war on the United States back in 1983 and actually targeted the Murrah building a good 12 years before McVeigh blew it up. So I think that made it easier for Americans, the idea that it's just alone crazy, to kind of move on. Let's move on, as unfortunately many of these horrible incidents that we've lived through here of violence. But given where we're at, the hyper-partisanship and the rise in threats of political violence, especially as we count down to this upcoming election, I think it's more relevant than ever, and that's kind of what motivated us.
But what's amazing is that it was the single deadliest attack against the government in U.S. history. So for that not to be covered, to me, indicates, maybe it was just we couldn't process that it was one of our own. But it is still shocking,
Yeah, I mean, or is it, do you also think it's one of these things where I hear exactly what you're saying. I also wonder, is there an element to, like you said, the whole human processing, even as a society, the fact that the guy was caught almost immediately, he's got put on trial. We can have a discussion later about whether he acted alone or not, but, done and dusted, right? We've sorted it out, kind of, almost, and we can box it and shelve it almost.
I think that's a good point, because he was executed, not only found guilty, but he was executed. And It all happened as the Clinton administration promised, swift and severe. They were successful in that. And I think you're right. For a lot of people with the execution of McVeigh, it's like, okay, let's move on. Right. So I think that's a good point you've raised.
Yeah. And maybe they didn't want to humanize him or glorify him. But his personal story is pretty interesting, because he was a pretty bright guy, very articulate, a true believer, that he spent time in prison. We've done a lot of prison documentaries, and usually people, they change when they're in prison. Right. And really stuck to his guns to the very end. Whereas Terry Nichols, his accomplice, is repentant.
Right. And in fact, yes, I mean, I think that's, so we haven't even mentioned his name, but, we're talking about Timothy McVeigh. I mean, he, you're right. And almost this whole issue of, I think someone said he he kept his eyes open right to the very end, even when he was on the gurney and being executed. And there's one view that he was not going to reveal anything because he didn't want to reveal his collaborators, if you will. And then there's also another element of he wanted, and as you said, you've done done documentaries on people in prison, but also an element that he wanted to take full credit for it and almost get that, I hate to use the word, but the glory from it. Is that, or is there is there an element of truth to both those sides of things?
I think there's an element of truth to both of those. I don't think he disclosed everything.
Yeah.
And I think that, as his lawyer says in our film, Stephen Jones, he wanted the infamy. He wanted to be seen as a martyr who kind of lit the fuse for the Second American Revolution. And what's so scary is that there are people today who actually see him like that.
But he felt that he didn't have any options, I think, economically. So he sort of painted himself into this role. And in many ways, he may have felt that there really was no turning back. Yeah. I mean,
Well, I think that's very interesting, Daphne, and you, as you were saying earlier as well, Marc. I mean, what the film also tries to do is contextualize all this. And what I found one of the many things I found interesting was that you take this all the way back to the economics of the 1970s and 80s, and I had never quite looked at it that way, and then that has relevance to today as well. But maybe you could say more about it. Especially the hollowing out of sort of rural America and what was going on with the farming crisis at the time.
I thought that was fascinating.
Right.
You know that the family farms went under, but
right.
really think that much about it. You just thought, well, it's unfortunate, but I guess we're moving on as a culture. We're not going to do that anymore. And then,
right.
We outsourced the factories because supposedly people didn't want to do those jobs anymore. And we were moving into a post-industrial service economy. And but we actually did a film on what happened to manufacturing in this country through the story of the garment industry. And what we learned is that it wasn't just, people bent over sewing machines, elbow to elbow. I mean, these were vibrant industries that were diversified, and there were a lot of little businesses and accountants and, seamstresses, and there was so much opportunity and upward mobility. But, there was that shift to globalization that didn't really take into account how it was going to affect these small businesses and working people.
I mean, those factory jobs you're talking about, a lot of them were unionized, a lot of them were quite well paying, and U.S. moved to a services economy, but there's services and then there are services, and the type of services jobs that were often brought in, if they were to replace them, didn't nearly pay as well, and certainly didn't hire as many people as
right. And McVeigh faced that. I mean, his grandfather worked in the GM battery factory for 30 years with good benefits, good union pay. His father worked in the same factory for 30 years, but that wasn't available to him as he came of age. In fact, he ended up for a while doing a service job as Social Security, low paying. So there's no doubt that the economic dislocation, the incredible inequality that we see now, the greatest since the Gilded Age, really.
Right.
These are seedbeds for, extremism. And that's what happened starting with the farm crisis in rural America. As you said, it was demagogues of the right that were able to capitalize and exploit that frustration, that anger, that rage at times against the federal government. And as you saw in the film, we were lucky enough to meet up with a former extremist, Kerry Noble, who sadly passed away last year, but who really gave us an inside perspective on how that trickled down to these groups that all of a sudden were ready to take up arms and declare war on the government, and that, again, had targeted the Murrah building, the same building McVeigh hit 12 years later.
Yeah. Now, I mean, let's be fair. Most people who found themselves in these situations didn't become so radicalized or join extreme.
Absolutely.
Obviously,
But it doesn't take much, and also, as Kathleen Ballou's thesis, which is intriguing, is that actually it's in the wake of war, that the most recruits for violent extremism happens. So not only did you have this economic dislocation, then you've got the Gulf War, where McVeigh was a hero, but he turned bitter because two things. One, he saw America as a bully, that it was overkill. He witnessed some of those horrors. And the other was that he didn't make the Green Beret tryout because he was so worn out right after coming back from combat. And that left him very, very angry.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very good, interesting point, because only just a few episodes ago, we had Charlie Sadoff on, who did the Against All Enemies. I don't know if you've seen that documentary. So it's very much a companion piece, I would say, with this.
I would love to see those doubled up somewhere. I think that would be a great double bill.
Obviously she, I forget her name, the expert you were talking about, is it Ballou?
Ballou.
Yeah. So she's on there as well, and I think says similar things. And so we had a lot of discussion too. but I thought what was good, what you added to it as well, because as he's pointing out nowadays, some of these groups that are now the successors to the groups of the 80s and 90s are actually actively targeting military veterans. But one thing I hadn't picked up on was previously was McVeigh's experience during the Gulf War, and as you said, what he saw. And even though he won I think he got a gold star, and I think Bronze Star, yeah. That all this was like a recipe, if you will, for someone of his whatever personality, demeanor to become radicalized.
And the one thing I would add, the final thing, which we try to kind of cinematically recreate in a certain way with his car, the Road Warrior, which kind of appears at the beginning of the film, the end of the film, a few places, was that the being bombarded by talk radio and hate speech and tapes of violent rhetoric, the Turner Diaries, that of course we have a First Amendment, which is important, but to think that as you just said, when you have this recipe and then you have people just throwing this at you, and then for 2 years he kind of traveled the country in that Road Warrior, which is almost like a behavior modification chamber.
Right.
So I think that's important, because today you don't have to be in a Road Warrior. You can be right at home at your computer like this, and you can, kind of be conditioned.
You just brought a lot of memories back for me. I will say, oddly enough, in that I used to travel across the United States quite a bit, going back and forth between home and school in the 90s, and traveling late at night. And before satellite radio, before all this, these new innovations we've had. And so you were just beholden to whatever radio signal you could get. And in the middle of the night, traveling across, and yes, the stuff that was coming over the air. I mean, and also the way not to get into yet or so much into the art of the filmmaking, but also the way the sound that you use and created, it sounded like my old radio in my car from the 90s. I felt like, I remember this. I remember that guy. I would try to move on to another station, but I didn't stay on those stations, but they were quite, and they were daily. They were on daily. They were just like pounding this message on a daily basis, and I can see, that must be. Yeah, I can't imagine what I would have turned out if I'd kept listening to that kind of stuff. But so I guess he's there's this other thing too, and then. We're talking about this to carry the metaphor further, probably further than it should. Adding to this is also these events, right? So you had Ruby Ridge, right? And then that you talk about, and then you had Waco and the Branch Davidians, and we know it's no coincidence that Timothy McVeigh sets the bomb on April 19th, because that's the 2-year anniversary of what happened at Waco with the Branch Davidians. And, it was, I think you're very upfront about this. There was some, heavy-handed police tactics being used on both Democratic and GOP administrations at the time, especially with the ATF. Not to try to finger point at ATF, but there were, in some ways the government didn't do us any favors in a way. Absolutely.
I want to just say one thing, since we are talking to the UK. April 19th is the day the famous first shot of the Revolutionary War against Great Britain. Here, the rebels in the United States at Lexington Concord. So it's been called Patriots' Day. But it's in this recent mix of extremism in the post-Vietnam era that day has been embraced, by the so-called patriot movement. And it's a significant day that Americans should be aware of. You named two of the significant things happened. Actually, the Covenant of the Sword and the Arm of the Lord, another one of these extremist groups in the 80s, they were busted on that day, April 19th also.
Right.
And amazingly enough, the Columbine tragedy was originally the two of those young men who didn't live far from Denver, which is where the trials were moved. They had planned to blow up the school on April 19th, but they couldn't get all the explosives and everything. And then they did their shooting rampage the next day, April 20th. So the date is significant. There's no doubt about it. And that is part of I think the film's message is just, this is a date we should know. Certainly every high school student should know, just like, 9/11 and December 7th, Pearl Harbor.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the other point is, surely two of these things happen at the government's instigation, right? And I'm not trying to be a government conspiracist or anything, but surely you could have just moved it back one day or done a slightly different day. It didn't were they that clueless? Were they just not thinking, like that group you're talking about, the
you're talking about the execution of Richard Snell?
Exactly. The execution of Richard Snell. They go in against his organization in the 80s. I think surely there could be a better day.
Yeah. I mean, they say it's a coincidence, but the government was warned not to execute Richard Snell on that day, that it was a dangerous thing to do. In fact, Reverend Millar, the spiritual leader of Elohim City, spoke publicly about it. It's in newspaper articles, like imploring the government not to execute on that day.
Didn't listen. Also, like you said, it's like the Trump campaign kicked off in Waco, of all places.
Right.
Again, they claimed they didn't realize it was the 30th anniversary of the tragedy there, and what it's come to symbolize. I don't know if it's just incompetence or if it's like, okay, we're going to make a statement too.
Right. Well, I think actually let's give our listeners and our viewers a quick break. So just to say that we'll be right back with Marc Levin and Daphne Pinkerson, the award-winning filmmakers behind An American Bombing: The Road to April 19th, on HBO and streaming on Max. You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or X to keep up to date with new releases or upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. Now back to Factual America. Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with Marc Levin and Daphne Pinkerson, the filmmakers behind An American Bombing: The Road to April 19th. It's already broadcast on HBO, and you can find it streaming on Max. And if you don't have access, Google it. I'm sure you'll have ways of accessing it at some point in the near future.
You're right, Google it. I saw somebody's already got it up, how you can see Europe.
Marc and Daphne, we were talking about April 19th. This originally the shot heard around the world from Lexington, Massachusetts. That's now got a different resonance. So the film also focuses on how McVeigh did this, and we were talking a little bit about this earlier. Obviously, he had his co-collaborator, he had Terry Nichols, and we know others were involved. Was he really a lone wolf, do you think? I mean, because that's something you do explore a little bit. I know you want the viewers to kind of come to their own conclusions, but do you think he did act alone, or is it just impossible that he could have just done this all on his own in terms of this bombing in Oklahoma City?
It's one of those eternal questions that I would say this, where I land is, I don't know. I know Mike Betcher at our screening, felt very strong that it was difficult to imagine that he did it all alone. 22 people saw him that morning with somebody else. So that's pretty compelling. I mean, obviously eyewitnesses can be wrong. Many are wrong, but to have 22 people in the FBI 302s say they saw him with somebody else is certainly raises questions and makes it, more probable. For me, though, it always goes to the cover-up. In other words,
right.
It seems, and again, this is just conjecture, speculation, as you said. And in the film, we try to present all perspectives, and you make your own conclusions. But my conclusion is that law enforcement, FBI, ATF, had sources in this world.
Right.
But those sources, confidential informants, undercover assets, they can go bad. They can double cross you. And there were screw ups. Now, of course, it's on the record that Carol Howe was a source for the ATF, and that there were ones. But there may have been others, and it's always cover up that we could have stopped it, we screwed up somehow, or the competition between the ATF and the FBI. You just mentioned Ruby Ridge and Waco. There was a lot of heated animosity between those organizations. They may have both had undercovers or sources at Elohim City. So I'm just saying the Andreas Strassmeyer connection, he's that German that happened to be living at Elohim City for 3 years, and then McVeigh called 2 weeks before the bombing. He's a mystery character. We spoke to him off the record, and it only further left me feeling that he was potentially a source to some, whether it was German, Israeli, U.S. intelligence. So that's my sense is we don't know the whole story, whether we'll ever know it, and how much McVeigh was a loner in the end. I don't know.
And it could have been that he was inspired by people like Louis Beam, who recommended using, leaderless resistance as a methodology. I mean, after the Pinkerson trial, Bob Sands explains in the film that, they came to realize that having these compounds, these sort of paramilitary compounds, were not the way to go, and that, there needed to be a sort of plausible deniability to protect the leaders.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you still had, so if he did, I mean, one place he could have gotten help, which is sort of also what you're alluding to, is that it's this organization we talked about before, this covenant, the sword and the arm of the Lord, right? And these people, I think it was interesting. I don't know if I was aware of the bank robberies and, the interesting fundraising techniques that they had.
Right. No, that's another good one. The Aryan Republican Army, also known as the Midwest Bank Robbers. Daphne and I also had a conversation with the leader of that group, who used to be Peter Langham and has now transitioned to Donna Langham.
Okay.
First sex change operation that I know of in federal prisons, where he's serving a life term. But it certainly, again, left us thinking that there may be more connections there than most people know. They had modeled themselves after a group called the Order, which in the 80s, committed the assassination of Alan Berg, right, DODJ, and did the big bank armored car robberies. So yeah, that's a fascinating lead. And then, of course, in the film, as you saw, Terry Nichols has his own theory.
Right.
Then how credible that is, of course, a question, since, he has repented for what he did and regrets it, but he still obviously has strong anti-federal government feelings. But he does bring up this character, Roger Moore, who's another one of these mystery characters. He's passed away, but who McVeigh had an alliance with, a friendship with, spent time with. They worked together on the gun circuit, but he's got a very shady past, just like Strassmeyer's got was in the German army. His family, his father was the aide to Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany. I mean, he wasn't just a nobody.
And he lived on a kibbutz in Israel.
Yeah, he lived on a kibbutz in Israel. Yeah, so and Roger Moore also had connections to the FBI. Had been part of an FBI sting trying to sell illegal weapons to people. So yeah, there are legitimate questions. At the same time, as Daphne said, and Bob Sands summed up, I think the federal government saw what happened in 1988 in Fort Smith, where they did try to round up, 10 to 12 of these leaders, and everyone was acquitted. It was such a stunning setback that they didn't want to make that mistake again. So they really honed in on McVeigh. Obviously, he was more than willing to accept that. In fact, he chose to forfeit his appeal rights and so that he would be executed quicker.
So very fascinating, and just recommend everyone to go watch this to have a little bit more if you haven't already, and have more insight in terms of what we're all talking about. But if we bring this to the present, I mean, and that's also what your film's about. Have we learned any lessons from Oklahoma City, do you think?
No.
Quick, okay.
Well, it's funny. I mean, here, a few things are happening right now. But just today in the New York Times, there's an op-ed by Ross Dohat about how this film that came out by a UK director, Civil War, was had a big opening weekend. I haven't seen it yet. We want to go see it. But he wrote an op-ed piece in today's paper that, that really couldn't happen. And, his thinking, why? I wanted to just reach through the paper and said, you better watch this film. You saw Civil War. And of course, he didn't like the film because he felt it didn't in any way look at the causes, where this would come from, what the ideologies behind it were. It was a war film with the correspondents as the heroes. And our film obviously tries to show where some of this ideology that it's legitimate to use violence against the state and to have an insurgency. And if you read the Turner Diaries, how a small group can cause chaos. Just think, the CSA, which you mentioned, they had barrels of cyanide. Can you imagine if one city, New York City, LA, a huge city, was poisoned and hundreds of thousands of people died? The chaos. So a small group of people, there was just a Homeland Security warning that we got a message this morning from Mike, about fiber optics infrastructure as a target of new extremist groups. My point is just simply that you look at this film and you see this movement, and the fact that I say no, what I mean is a lot of these ideas which we thought were fringe back then and so extreme that we didn't have to worry about, maybe it was just one or two crazies. Now it's mainstream. Now you got people in governors' mansions and Congress, even in the White House, kind of repeating some of this ideology and amping up this sense of we're in a battle to save the republic. And sometimes violence is needed, as in the American Revolution. So that's why I say no. And that's why I think the film is important. But the idea that the conditions, we have this American exceptionalism. It can't happen here. It can happen in Ukraine. It can happen in Yugoslavia, but not here in the United States. Well, unfortunately, I'm not so sure of that anymore. And that, when you say, have we learned lessons? I think as we were talking earlier, just saying, okay, he's dead, let's move on. He may be dead, but the ghost of McVeigh lives. And there are lots of people out there that subscribe to some of his thinking.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you the Civil War question, because I think also, and I haven't read the column yet. I do read Ross Douthat, but I think it's also how people. I mean, I think for some of us who are I'm naturally skeptical of everything, but I think anyone who's skeptical is kind of like, well, I asked this question of someone else actually on the program, and he's like, well, I don't think there's going to be literally like armies lining up like you had in the American Civil War. When he's talking about, but do I think there's going to be, is there a real chance for political violence? And in the near future, yes. And I think that's probably, that, and I guess what you would say is, look, we only have to look back less than 4 years ago and we had it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, luckily, look, I accept that 168 people were killed in Oklahoma City, and in the riots at the Capitol, one person was shot and killed, and a number of police obviously had injured and died in the aftermath, which is a tragedy. But the body count's not the same,
right?
So I get that, but the symbolism, of attacking the federal government. That's the idea. And the illegitimacy of the federal government and the legitimacy of using violence to, in some way, make your point. And in polls, and this is what I found stunning about Douthat's article, the polls actually contradict what he says. There's more of an acceptance now than there was then of political violence as being legitimate to change certain policies. Now, we did a whole film on the anti-abortion movement, which had already made that same claim, that it was legitimate to kill doctors and others who were providing abortion services. And they had an underground. We did a film about them training the next shooter.
Right.
So, this has come in and out of the American experience. But now, when you just hear people on mainstream outlets kind of saying so blithely, like maybe we need a civil war, or like you said, it's more of the idea of an insurgency.
Right.
A small group that's willing to put their life on the line. You just mentioned that other movie, which I think was very effective in looking at some of the groups today that are using that same leaderless resistance, the idea that you don't need armies, you just need to hit, what if somebody hit a nuclear power plant? I mean, it's scary. And then you create this chaos and fear that people want a strong leader and demagogues can move in. And that's kind of the blueprint of the Turner Diaries, which was McVeigh's Bible.
Okay.
But I think you have to look at the why. I mean, in a way, the insurgency is the what and the symptom and the reaction.
Right.
There's been 30 years of economic restructuring in this country and in many Western European countries.
Correct.
And the support for right-wing governments has been increasing as the economies have gotten worse, and there's a bigger gap between rich and poor. And it's, there's the cultural divide is really, it's manufacturing and agriculture on one side. And then on the other side, it's high-tech industries and professional services, people with college degrees and higher who prioritize the government. And they don't care if, you put a tax on diesel and,
Exactly.
the people in the rural areas can't, get to work. Right. I mean, the depth of, I think, resentment are really not fully appreciated. And it drops out of the conversation and it's focused on, immigrants, but that is, I think, exploited by these right-wing politicians. And then on the so-called left wing, they're saying the economy's doing great, vote for me. But really, the economy is not doing great for most people. They're, they're employed, but they're working part-time jobs for, little pay, and they're resentful. I mean, we also did a film with Sanjay Gupta called One Nation Under Stress that looked at the spike in the mortality rate in the United States. And it was discovered by these, two Princeton economists who their formulation was that people were dying deaths of despair based on their dashed expectations of what their lives were going to be like. And these were mostly, blue collar workers who didn't have college degrees, and they were dying from opiate overdose, cirrhosis of the liver from, alcohol, and suicide, So I think it's important to me, that is should be the biggest focus, the biggest emphasis. Because if we don't reach out to those people and stop sort of making it seem like all Trump supporters are exactly the same, it's going to be the end of us. And, there's this interesting book written by this academic, Barbara F. Walter. She's an expert on civil wars and the signs that civil war is possible. And one of them is that the government is not representing a huge swath of people.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that that's summed up at the end of our film by a kind of homespun line of Daniel Coss when he says, poke a dog long enough and the dog's going to bite back. Right. I mean, you mistreat, humiliate, and subjugate people. And at some point, things are going to erupt. So that's our warning.
Yeah. Okay. And that takes us full circle, right? Because Daniel Coss, if I recall correctly, is he the uncle of?
Right.
Yeah, he had nephews die in Oklahoma City. He had been in the military, just like McVeigh. He'd been on the Oklahoma City police, and then he's a security consultant to the Capitol on January 6th. I mean, when you, as filmmakers, when you can cover something like that, it's just film gold, isn't it? I mean, not to make light of the situation.
Thank you for saying that. Can we quote you on that? Because that is so true. When we went down to Arkansas and got together with Kathy again, Kathy Sanders, who's a main character in the film, and she revealed this, I was like, no, you couldn't script this. The man who found her two little grandbabies, and as you said, that he would end up on January 6th with the Capitol Police. It's just so, what a twist of fate. And he's an incredibly interesting character also, his own parallels with McVeigh, as you said, serving in the military. So yeah, no, that was gold. You're one of the few people we've spoken to that has really used that term, because that's how I felt when I heard it. I was like, that is gold.
Right.
But I'm glad, I appreciate that you picked up on that.
Well, it's just this, whether April 19th was a coincidence in all these other cases, I mean, to come across something like that is just, and we do tend to, we tend to focus a bit more on the filmmaking side of things and not just talk about the subjects. But I couldn't believe that myself when that came out. I was like, wait a minute. I even paused it. I was like, wait a minute. Who is that guy? How did that happen? It's like.
But look, I'm really glad, because it goes to, on the filmmaking side, let's talk about that for a second, because I think that was the key to a certain strategy that was not easy to execute. Meaning, we wanted to tell the story, what we kind of jokingly refer to as the TikTok, the crime story of this horrible event for a new generation that was not aware of it and didn't understand the significance. At the same time, there were these people we had met back 29 years ago, and their stories and the resilience and even the sense of purpose some of them got in the wake of the tragedy. Marcia with the victims' rights movement, Bud with becoming a human rights activist and an anti-death penalty advocate. And then finally, the idea of forgiveness that some of the characters like Bud and Kathy are capable of. I'm not sure I would be, but that human side, what I call, everybody wants to hurt, and that's the crime and the horror, but where's the heart? And there was tremendous heart from the people we knew in Oklahoma back then, and we wanted to find a way to weave those together into a whole, and it wasn't easy. to
Right.
kind of make that one. But that moment of finding out that Daniel Coss was there at the Capitol January 6th, that was the key to being able to try to create a structure where we could weave in and out of the big story, and then this human story comes in and out, and it all comes together. So that was, it took it took some time.
Yeah, because what did this film look like before you came across that? I mean,
Well, that was very early on.
oh, was it early on?
film.
Okay.
Yeah. So that the idea for the structure, and one of the things Daphne and I, again on the filmmaking side, the first assembly was like 3.5, 4 hours, and there was a discussion with HBO. Obviously, should we make it a series,
Right.
or do we do it as a single, feature documentary? We decided to go the single route because of this, what you just said. In other words, if that had been in episode 4 and we stretched it out,
Right.
I don't know that it would have the same emotional impact.
Right.
And we wanted the film to have a heart and emotional impact. There were lots of rabbit holes. We raised a few here in the discussion a few minutes ago that could have been, the ARA could have been an episode, Elohim City could have been an episode, that we could have really, and others will, explore. But we didn't want to lose that heart. And so we felt if we could put it all in under 2 hours, that would work. And that's why we made that decision.
I know we don't have much time left together, but I will, if I may follow up on that, is that do you have a preference? Or do you prefer series or feature over series, or is it back to this whole what other filmmakers have always told me? You as long as you do what it takes to tell the story, and if that's a few episodes, you do it that way, or if it's a feature, you do it in 90 minutes or so. That's the way to go about it. Do you have a view on that, or is in terms of series?
I have vacillated and done, thankfully, both. I think the one thing about the feature is it's more evergreen. It's easier, 20 years from now to go back to Oklahoma, an American bombing. The road to April 19th, than it is a 4-hour series. It just it has more of a shelf life, I think, and also on the educational front and the non-theatrical, special events, things like that. But look, a series can be great too. There's no doubt about it. There are a lot of great ones, and we've been lucky enough to do some really good ones. But right now, that's where my head was at.
Okay.
I think, this, the 30th anniversary is coming up, and we already know there are like a raft of films and series that are in production. And when we started, we didn't even really think about the fact that it was, the 30th was coming up, and we already started. And so, we figured we're going to be sort of the first out of the gate. And this is a big picture film that puts it in historical context. Really would have lost the sweep of that, I think. We're really going to keep bringing up the farm prices and outsourcing every episode.
Right.
So I think it was better to do it this way. But I would certainly watch a series that, digs into the ARA and Strassmeyer and Carol Howe. And there's just so much circumstantial evidence that McVeigh was intersecting with other people, in the years leading up to the bombing.
Okay. Well, speaking of your career and what you've been able to do and continue to do, what's next for you after this project? Well,
first of all, we have a film that's coming out, being re-released in 2 weeks.
Great.
That's called Slam. It was released in the UK.
Yeah.
And is being re-released thanks to the Academy of Motion Pictures, Sundance Institute, and UCLA, who started a restoration and preservation program for cinema around the world, really. But now they're also including independents. And this was one of the indie films chosen. So the film is opening at the Roxy, a new art house in Tribeca, Manhattan. So we're on to that. We have another film that's out now, just kind of making the rounds. It just played the Cleveland International Film Festival. It's called It's Basic. It's on the whole guaranteed income movement, the universal basic income movement.
Right.
That's out now. We have a film we're finishing on Helene Flowers, super predator to superhero, character we met in the DC jail 25 years ago. It's interesting how these stories that we kind of stumbled into 25 years ago are coming back. And then we're starting another historical documentary about what's been called the Hard Hat Riot. I don't know if you heard that. It's a best-selling book about the first week of May in 1970 when Kent State happened and Nixon invaded Cambodia. And here in New York City that Friday, the construction workers working on the New World Trade Center, came down and beat up all the anti-war protesters.
Right.
And this author, David Cohn, has done a great job in kind of showing how that was an inciting incident in this movement of the white working class away from the New Deal, away from the Democratic base, and this split that Daphne was talking about, that, between college educated and then blue collar, how that became kind of a symbolic and inciting incident that the reverberations we're still living with now. So that's another one.
So not much on then.
No. We're lucky. I mean, because I saw yesterday, as we were talking earlier, that Participant Films is closing. I'm assuming you saw that news in Hollywood. And although we never really, we did that New Jersey thing after Brick City. They were, an outpost for social, political, environmental, obviously, with the Al Gore film, Inconvenient Truth is how they launched.
Right.
But the idea that they're closing their door now because the marketplace is so hostile to films like that. I mean, one of our colleagues, we gave a sneak preview to, Daniel Lowell, and he came out and goes, "This may be the last real documentary." And, we just kind of laughed and said, "What do you mean?" But I think what he meant is what the participant folks said yesterday, that just right now there's a hostile environment. The joke is that you need the 3 C's: crime, celebrity, and cult.
Yeah.
Now you could say this film has some of that. I mean, obviously, that's murder. It's got a cultish angle. And we do have a celebrity that we should acknowledge. Katie Couric was executive producer.
That's right.
Helped us tremendously in getting to President Clinton and some of the other high-profile characters. And she actually originally brought an idea about Oklahoma to HBO, which then they brought us all together. But yeah, that's kind of the joke. If you have anything outside that, it's just, very difficult right now. I don't know what the atmosphere in the UK is. But it's tricky. We've been lucky to have been, as a boutique, to be able to navigate, but it's trickier and trickier.
Is the same thing happening there?
It's in a way. I mean, what you have is if you're getting something commissioned here in the UK, you don't have the budgets that you have in the US. That's always been the case. But budgets are even tighter than they were, and different. You have a smaller number of sort of broadcasters, if you will, and others, and they are cutting their staffs, and they're happy. My understanding is, in talking to some filmmakers here, they're happy to come in at the end, maybe provide some finishing funds, that kind of thing. But they're not. I mean, there are exceptions to this, obviously. I think you never know, because
BBC isn't BBC doing a series on the Oklahoma City bombing? Isn't that one of the, or is it ITV?
I wouldn't be
surprised. Out of London is doing already, talking to people that we know, right?
Yeah.
The British crews are.
There's definitely a British series being done.
So I wouldn't be surprised if they are, but I do know also that the people I know who are pitching films and things like that, they're just finding these conversations are just taking forever. right?
Yeah.
You just, and then you think you think everyone's on the same page, and then someone higher up comes back and says, "No, we need we need this. We may need one of the C's that you're talking about, or we need to get a celebrity attached to this, or even as an exec." I feel like I should bring some of the people I know on to answer this question better than I can, but I do think everyone is saying it's difficult. And it always has been, I guess, but it just seems it's difficult in a different way, I think.
Right. Are you going to have Alex Garland on your show? The director of Civil War?
We haven't. I don't know if we've reached out to him. So I work with some people who are finding people like you, or people like your PR firm find us. So that's always nice. And that works out quite well. I don't know if anyone's reached out to him, but you know what? It would be the perfect triumvirate trilogy here.
You did the other film.
I've done this film.
And those are the films that people need to see before seeing Alex's film, or after. I'm not sure what order, since we haven't seen it yet. But I would love him to see our film. That's for sure.
Right. All right. Well,
you said you had a particular intersection with this story.
Well, okay. Not to bore people, it's not about me. It's about you and your film and the interesting things we've been talking about. So I was born and raised in Texas, and in 1997, I flew back to meet up with my brother, and we were going to drive up to Oklahoma City because that's where my sister was living, and she was about to give birth to her first child, the first grandbaby in the family, my first niece. And along the way, my mother's family is from the Waco area. So we met up with my aunt and uncle, and we went for dinner. And they're like, "Would you like to drive by the Branch Davidian compound?" And we're like, "When you're in your 20s, well, of course." You say, "Yes, let's do it." So we got in the car, and they drove by. And of course, this is, it would have been 4 years later. Yeah. So there was someone still living on a trailer on the compound at the time. And so, and then within 24 hours, I was standing there in front of where the Murrah building used to be, looking at the site there, and that fence that you showed where I found that interesting. Is that fence still up that had all the different peoples had left notes? Very similar to what we saw in 9/11, a few years later. So all those notes were still there, and the stuffed animals and the teddy bears and stuff, people, and it was just, it was just, we didn't joke about it. My brother and I were just like, it's the right-wing extremist tour or whatever we're doing. But,
Waco,
here we've gone to Waco, now we've gone to Oklahoma City. What's next, on the list, right? So, but it was very poignant because you talk about some people, like you said, people forget their history. I knew the connection. I definitely knew there was a connection there in terms of those dates and why McVeigh was doing it. It came out at the time, certainly. But it's one of these, when you talk about connecting the dots, a lot of times those dots have been connected in the past, but then someone's rubbed them out, and we forget, right?
That's right.
So that's my connect. And the other connection being a distant cousin of mine owned a farm near the Branch Davidian compound, and he did okay for himself. He's my granddad's cousin, because his farm was on a bluff that overlooked the compound, and so he was able to charge all the media people to set up their trucks and everything when they were filming the standoff. So I didn't know about this, but I was visiting my granddad, and he's like, "Oh, so and so, he's done all right for himself. He's he got CBS and NBC and all these people camped out at his farm." So it's not that interesting. It's just the world we live in. You have all these connections that you don't expect, just like you've come across that in your filmmaking. So thanks again so much for being on. We really enjoyed it. Thanks. I'm glad you're continuing to make movies. Would love to have you on again sometime. And just to remind our viewers and listeners, we've been talking to Marc Levin and Daphne Pinkerson, the award-winning filmmakers behind An American Bombing, The Road to April 19th, on HBO and streaming on Max. Do check it out. Thanks again for joining us on Factual America. A big shout out to everyone at Intersound Audio in York, England for their great studio and fine editing and production skills. A big thanks to Amy Ord, our podcast manager, who ensures we continue getting great guests onto the show and that everything otherwise runs smoothly. Finally, a big thanks to you, our listeners. Please keep sending us feedback and episode ideas, whether it is on YouTube, social media, or directly by email. And please also remember to like us and share us with your friends and family, wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. This is Factual America, signing off. You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, which specializes in documentaries, television, and shorts about the U.S. for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is factualamerica.com.